Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. It's October 19th, 2021. I'm Ulrike Schede, Professor of Japanese Business at UCSD and Director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. At GPS, we are an international relations and public policy school. We have a lot of degrees, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do various things, including, of course, this Zoominar, and more information about us can be found at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go there, you'll find a tab called News and Media, where you can sign up for our JFIT San Diego Japan Newsflash, which is a bi-weekly fun little newsletter. And right next to that tab is the Japan Zoominars tab, where you can sign up for upcoming events, and also in our JZ gallery, listen to past events. We've recently reorganized this and it looks like this now. So there are 4 categories of past events: business and economy and politics will look like this if you open it up. And some we actually put in both categories. So you could just after this go in and look what else we have in politics or business and economy. So our Zoomina meets every other week on Tuesdays at 4:30. Today, of course, we're talking about America's aging allies, of which more shortly. Please make a note in your calendar on November 2nd. I'll have Axel Klein and Ken McElwain to talk about the election in Japan. I still think that the Democrats have a good shot at surprising everybody, but I don't think my 2 guests agree with me. So this promises to be good. And on November 16th, we're going back to the issue of energy, which is a long-standing interest of ours here. And it will be on Asia's long exit from overseas coal financing. So stay tuned and sign up. One more thing that's important to note is that later on in this event, you have the opportunity to type in questions in the Q&A button. And we will not refer to you by your last name. We'll only use your first name in order to maintain your privacy. And so today I have 2 leaders in the field of Japan foreign relations, US-Japan relations, and national security implications, Andrew Oros and Ellis Krauss. So let me stop here and introduce both of them. Hello, there they are. Thank you for joining me today, Ellis and Andrew. It's fantastic. So I'll start with our guest, Andrew Oros, and then Ellis, I'll seg into who you are, although most people probably know you already. So Andrew Oros is professor of political science and international studies at Washington College. He originally hails from Southern California, and his undergraduate degree was from USC and also the University of London. And then he earned his PhD in political science at Columbia in 2002. He's currently on sabbatical, that is enviable, as a fellow at the Wilson Center. And in the past, he's done several of these visiting stints. He was at the East-West Center in DC. He was a visiting professor at Keio, at Peking University in Beijing, at the National Institute of Defense in Tokyo, at the Sigur Center of Asian Studies at George Washington University, and many other places. So he's been around and he's talked to people. He's also the author of Japan's Security Renaissance, New Policies for the 21st Century, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2017, and the tantalizingly titled Normalizing Japan, Stanford University Press 2008, and many other books and papers. So you should look him up. He's a prolific writer and has a very, very deep and wonderful thoughts, which is why he's here today, together with Ellis Krauss, who is Professor Emeritus at GPS. We've been colleagues for 25 years, Ellis. It's a little bit amazing. Before joining us here at UCSD, he was professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. And before that at Western Washington University. He's been a visiting scholar at many places. He's one of the best known Japan political scientists of our times. And that was actually recognized by the Emperor of Japan, who awarded you, Ellis, the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, with gold leaves and a neck ribbon. There are many other awards, but that one I think stands out. He has written, I think, 8 books. I can't keep up with you. Yeah, oh, well, there you go. And more than 36 papers. And so it's great to have you as a colleague here. And Ellis is, of course, retired, but when Andrew's latest research landed on his desk, he called me up and said, this is interesting. We should do this as a JZ. So thank you, Ellis, for the initiative, for bringing Andrew here. And gentlemen, I'm just going to let you have half the stage. I'm going to sit with the audience. I'm going to take a seat in the first row, and I'll be back in 50 minutes or so to wrap it up. So have fun.
Thank you, Ulrike. Always a gracious introduction and a fitting one for Andrew, who is not only a distinguished scholar with some very interesting research in the past and very fascinating research coming out that I don't think anybody else has really dealt with as extensively as he has, but also an old friend who introduced my wife and I to one of the funkiest, most interesting restaurants in Tokyo, which used to be a few blocks from where he used to live, and we have gone back there many times. So thank you for that and for being a colleague, Andrew. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew. Please take the floor.
Great.
Or at least the screen.
Thank you so much, Ellis and Ulrike, for having me back to California, my home state, and back to San Diego, my mom's hometown. I wish it could be in person, but it's great to be able to reach a global audience this way and to stay connected. So I'm really happy about that. I'm also happy to have a chance to share my research findings to date on this project before I get back into the field to wrap up the research, hopefully by the end of next summer. Next up on my list is Seoul. I'll be spending a month in South Korea starting next month, thanks to a grant from the Korea Foundation. And then hopefully I'll be getting back to Japan next summer. What I'm going to present on today is mostly will focus on the Japanese case, and I'm going to share the research findings based on initial research that I conducted in Japan back in 2019. And then I've been conducting virtually based here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where I've been on leave for the last 14 months. So with that, let me share my screen, and I'll give you a kind of quick overview of the Japan case. And I look forward to some questions from Ellis and questions from the audience. So let me click share here. And I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to start with 4 sort of opening demographic statistics to get people sort of exposed to how much things are changing demographically in the Indo-Pacific, and to really underscore that we are in truly unprecedented times. We have no experience with the demographic trends that will be taking place over the next couple of decades. The opening point, again, focusing on Japan, today there are about 1.5 million fewer Japanese people in the world than there were a decade ago. That's more than the population of most American cities and even some states. And this population shrinkage is accelerating in Japan. I cut and pasted this graphic from the World Economic Forum agenda that shows the estimates of Japanese population decline linked to major US cities around the world. What's jumped out at me is the mid-2030s, where a population the size of the city of Los Angeles will disappear from the Japanese home islands. So this is a very big change that is underway. Secondly, as you know, the title of my book, which is under contract with Columbia University Press, is America's Aging Allies in Asia. So the demographic factor that I focus on the most is not actually population decline, but it's about aging. So Japan is the leader in aging, the world leader. It was the world's first super age society back in 2005, when over 20% of its population became 65 and over. In 2020, last year, that had reached 28.4%, and the projection by 2050 is that it will reach nearly 40%, and Japan will continue to be one of the oldest societies in the world. But Japan, although Japan was the first major country to experience population shrinking starting back in 2009, there are 5 other states in the Indo-Pacific that will soon be following and are also rapidly aging. And these are South Korea, China, Taiwan, Russia, and Thailand. So what you'll notice from that is that they're all of Japan's close neighbors, with the exception of Thailand. And North Korea, by the way, almost makes the cut, but is just right on the cusp. So according to the current projections, it's moving in the same direction, but it isn't quite at the extent of the other powers. Putting another way, just with like an opening statistic, by 2050, the projection is that the populations of Japan and China together will shrink by about 75 million people. Meanwhile, the population of Asia as a whole, which includes Western Asia, this is based on UN statistics, so countries like Afghanistan and Iran, the population of Asia as a whole will increase by over 700 million. And about 300 million of that is just from India alone. India will become the largest country in the Indo-Pacific in the middle of this decade. And by the way, I'm happy to talk about this further in Q&A. Of course, we don't know what the future of the COVID pandemic is going to be, and if a new pandemic might emerge in the next few decades. But according to the current state of the virus, it doesn't look like COVID-19 is going to substantially affect these projections. Obviously, it will affect them to some degree, and that's something we could talk about in Q&A. Lastly, just to this opening framing, because my project really focuses on the United States and Asia, looking at the US aging allies, let's mention the United States, because it's the demographic exception to what I've been talking about, not just in Asia, but actually in the entire developed world and the existing great powers. All of those countries have predicted population shrinkage, but the US alone is projected to enjoy population increase through 2050 of about 60 million. That number might be a little less than 60 million now because of the pandemic, but in any case, the trajectory is quite different. So what I'm interested in looking at is how this variable demographic shift is going to affect the regional security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, and then looking at how the US alliance system in the region itself is an aging structure that we need to rethink. So as I said, my project is across the Indo-Pacific. I examine 16 countries in the Indo-Pacific. I built a database of demographic factors that go through 2050 for 30 territories and island groupings, and then I narrow it down to 16 that I examine in more depth. If you'd like to take a look at that, by the way, it's posted on the Wilson Center's Asia Dispatches blog, a post from June 2021. There's several interactive maps you can slide to see the demographic change, and there are pop-up windows. If you click on individual countries, you can see individual data. But today we're going to talk about the case of Japan, and so the rest of our slides will largely do that. So, gone ahead, yes. So I would like to take a step back for a moment, because many of us, we get caught up in the challenges of demographics without sort of reflecting on what's really wrong with more Japanese people living long, healthy lives. I mean, this is not generally the problem that most countries would think are the #1 concerns, that Japan is still, it's very comfortable, it's a rich country, it's a beautiful country. So what is the problem? Moreover, I'll refer to a sociologist, Japanese sociologist's work, who wrote a book. I love the title of this book, The Happy Youth of a Desperate Country, which came out in 2011 and has been translated into English now, by the way, in 2017, if you don't read Japanese. But he reports that young Japanese report an unprecedented level of well-being and life satisfaction. Almost 80% of 20-somethings say they're quite satisfied with their lives. So again, this seems like quite a good thing. But then when we link to the demographics, it's intriguing that of this 80% who are quite satisfied, they're not choosing to have children. So the fertility rate, the birth rate in Japan is among the lowest in the world. And a concern that kind of comes out of that, I'm quoting a book that I'll talk about a little more in a moment called Peak Japan, but there's a section of the book called Comfort Leads to Complacency. And some of the statistics that come out of that work, one is quite striking. Just 11% of Japanese said in an opinion poll in 2014, a cross-national poll, that they were willing to fight for Japan if Japan were attacked by a foreign country. That number has gone up to 13% in the 2017 poll, by the way. This is the lowest level of all 64 countries surveyed. Ulrika Scheda's focuses especially on business. I thought I'd give a few quotes related to that. Again, from Peak Japan, a concern that there's a kind of dearth of entrepreneurial activity in Japan, especially among the young. There's a growing risk aversion among the young. So in short, the question is, has Japan peaked? And this is the title of the book that I just mentioned, Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions by Brad Glosserman in 2019. And he sets out this argument that Japan's demographics signal a fundamental turning point for Japan. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, especially in the area of national security, but it's a really provocative and timely read. I recommend. The demographics are only a part of his argument, but I want to focus on the demographics a little more, the aspect of his argument here. And this idea of peaking, so we know the Japanese population size peaked in 2008, and the population has been shrinking since then. If we want to think more broadly about relative economic size, it would depend somewhat on how you measure it, but somewhere around 2000 was when Japan's economy was the largest in comparison to all of the other countries in the Indo-Pacific. As I'm sure most of this audience knows, by 2010, the Chinese economy alone became larger than Japan's economy, now is nearing twice as big as the Japanese economy. Other Asian states are growing. Japanese economic growth has been averaging about 1% through these first 2 decades of Japan's rapid aging and population decline. And that's a real concern for thinking about, has Japan peaked? But what I'd like to say at this point, based on my research and the argument I'll present to you, is that Japan's security policies actually paradoxically have increased in capabilities, increased in goals and aspirations in the first decade that Japan is experiencing rapid aging and shrinking. This is the main argument of my last book that Ulrika Scheda mentioned, Japan's Security Renaissance from Columbia University Press, but this is not my view alone. Fellow Japan scholars here based in Washington, Sheila Smith and Jeffrey Horning, among others, have made similar arguments in their work. And we could talk about examples of that in Q&A if you'd like. There are many. So the question then is, well, do demographics actually matter then if what we find is Japan is doing more in the security realm as its population is shrinking and aging? And I think that it does for a few reasons I'll sketch out here briefly. First of all, recruitment challenges in Japan's self-defense forces. Japan, it's not a new thing that the Japan self-defense forces have recruitment challenges. This links also to Japan's anti-militarist culture, to other factors like Japan's defeat in the Second World War. But demographically speaking, I'll point out that Japan's population aged 18 to 26, the prime recruiting pool for the self-defense forces, peaked at 17 million people in 1994, decades ago. And Japan's self-defense forces has been unable to reach their recruiting targets from that period on. As a way to address that to some degree, they move the needle by actually lowering the goal of recruiting forces. And even still, they're managing only about 92% of what they're looking for. So about an 8% shortfall. And importantly, it's even a greater shortfall at the lower ranks. And I could talk about some of the implications of that in Q&A if you'd like. So this is not solely a demographic challenge, but if we look forward to the more increased demographic pressure Japan will experience, it's going to be an even bigger issue. I'll just note in passing, Robert Eldridge has written an excellent book in Japanese about the specific issue of the self-defense forces that I encourage you to take a look at if you can read Japanese. A second issue that I want to flag is the issue of defense spending. This is something that's in the media right now, so it's a very timely issue we may want to discuss. Japan runs the largest budget deficit of any developed country by far. It's over twice the deficit that the US has. And paradoxically, in the recent election manifesto of the Liberal Democratic Party, there's a proposal to, over time, double Japan's defense spending to 2% of GDP. I think that that is increasingly unlikely, not just for the domestic politics we may talk about, but because of the pressure that Japan will face due to its aging population. An argument I want to just flag and anticipate for people to perhaps ask about is what role new technology can play to offset some of the challenges of shrinking populations. And of course, technology can play a role in offsetting some of the challenges. In my focus on military security, however, it's important to note that many of the new technologies that may help deal with a shrinking workforce also create new security challenges that need to be addressed. So I'm thinking especially of cyber threats, for example, the concerns that can come from artificial intelligence. I write about this a little bit in the article that that Ellis Krauss had seen of mine that led to this talk that came out in Global Asia in June 2021. If you'd like to take a look at that, I encourage you to do so, or we can talk about it in Q&A. I also, before I wrap up, want to note the work of Tom Lee, a new rising scholar in Japan studies, who's based in California, in my hometown of Claremont. And I think his book, Japan's Aging Peace, is excellent. It's an entire book-length study of the topic that I'm talking about right now. In sum, though, Lee sees Japan's challenging demographics as reinforcing its longstanding anti-militarist constraints. And I'm not so sure about that personally, especially if you examine Japan relationally in its region, rather than looking just at Japan itself. And so that's what I want to close on. If we get back to the bigger picture, Japan, as I said at the outset, is not aging and shrinking in a vacuum. All of Japan's close neighbors are facing a similar future, though on somewhat later timelines. Meanwhile, new potential security partners for Japan and the US will grow in population and maintain robust youth populations. India and Indonesia are two of the top 9 states for growth through 2050. The US is number 9, by the way. India is number 1. And also other regional states like Australia, Singapore, and Vietnam will continue to grow for several decades. And I think it's not coincidental then that these states and the Philippines, which of course is a US ally, are among the states that both Japan and the US are seeking to deepen their security ties with. So just to sum up, these are the kind of broader factors why I'm writing a book-length manuscript on this topic, where Japan is playing a leading role. I think that a really important takeaway that I hope you get from this talk is that demographic change is a variable in the region. It's not a constant, but that it interacts with other factors like different types of security threats that different states face, different technological solutions that states may be able to deploy. And really importantly, for those of you interested in looking just at Japan or other specific cases, whether a political system or a social system is willing and able to adapt to the changes or it lags by, I think is going to be a really important factor. So in the case of Japan, demographic change is beginning to be felt in the security arena. There's been some modest responses that can be seen in the defense realm, but more significant challenges will need to be faced in the coming decade demographically, and I think they'll require bolder action to address. So thank you for the listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Andrew, could you shut your slides down?
Happy to.
Thank you. No, those are great. Those are fantastic. And as I said, really fascinating research. And we look forward to the book. I'm glad it's under contract too, to begin with. So as the moderator, I get, thanks to the format here of JFIT seminars, I get the first crack at you for questions. And then we'll open it to the audience. There's already been one question, and I'm sure there'll be more. In any event, my first question is a kind of a bridge to the last JFIT seminar, which was on the momentous 1960 AMPO demonstrations and their consequences. I did research on this as in my dissertation from Stanford, and also my first book, which turned into my first book, called Japanese Radicals Revisited, which was based on surveys and interviews with 1960 activists, intermittent activists, people who just got mobilized in the demonstrations but weren't part of the student movement Zengakuren, the militant student movement, and non-activists. And those people, I realized to my huge depression, are now close to 80 years old, even though it seems like, just like yesterday that I was interviewing them. That's how life goes. So what I was wondering is, I know there's been no future further systematic research since I did my book on this, but what about the older generations in Japan that you're referring to, the ones that are aging so rapidly, over 65, for example? Do you have any information on how they view the treaty and the alliance now, especially with aging voters constituting a greater and greater percentage of the population? That's an important point, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. The short answer is no. I don't have like recent data about how the older population in Japan may see some of these security issues differently than the younger generation, whether it's the alliance or viewing China or these things. I know that anecdotally, we don't see a major difference. There may be some minor changes. And, you know, with an election coming up, it's worth pointing out that if you look at the demographic and security literature, and there is a literature out there that makes predictions about what you should expect, one of the main takeaways that's often said is that older voters will want to protect their pension benefits, their health care and such, and they're going to be more conflict averse as a result. And I think that's true. Logically, you can expect that, but voters don't vote on just one issue. And I think what we don't see in any advanced industrial democracy is a party of older people versus a party of younger people, right? So you have LDP supporters who are older, you have Democrat supporters who are older, you have communist supporters who are older. And so I think that just sort of intuitively means that there can't be massive differences about support in the alliance or something. Otherwise, it would be the kind of the genesis of a party division, I think.
Yeah, that leads very naturally, your answer leads very naturally into my next question, which is because it indicates to me that that generation was certainly not the immediate post-war generation, but they grew up in the immediate post-war. But if there's no real difference between generations now, it indicates to me how resilient Japan's anti-militarist subculture is, because it's been passed on through generations to some extent, even though I believe it's eroding, but it's eroding very slowly. So that leads to my next question, which were, it used to be that two of the major obstacles to Japan's recruitment to the self-defense forces were its anti-militarist subculture. I remember the days when you went on a Tokyo subway and you never, ever, ever saw anybody in uniform. I mean, they would have been totally pariahs. Whereas now I've seen, you know, naval personnel, army personnel, self-defense force personnel on the subways, no problem. So I think it's eroding a little bit, if not in intensity, if not completely. And also the inequality of women, which has prevented more women from being recruited. That too is changing, albeit very slowly. I believe there was a recent captain of a maritime self-defense force vessel who was a woman for the first time in history. Mm-hmm. So that is changing a bit. But if these change further, wouldn't that help counteract Japan's severe aging problems with the alliance, making the budget problems for the aged much more the real problem in the future?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. But to elaborate on that a little bit, first of all, this is an area where I really do want to give another shout out to Tom Lee and his book on Japan's aging peace, because really the core, the meat of his argument is based on just this excellent work, including in the field of looking at, he has a table of every peace museum in all of Japan, and there's one in almost every prefecture, and he interviews the volunteers. And one of the issues is that most of the volunteers in those museums are older people, and as they become unable to do those activities, who is going to fill those roles? It's something that people in that museum world are really thinking about. But as you've said, Ellis, and I agree with you, there is a pretty good replication of that anti-militarist culture through the generations, more than one might think. And if you'll indulge me to make just a brief aside here, I'll point out that my initial findings in my research on the two cases that are most similar to Japan, which is South Korea and Taiwan, in those cases, there are very big generational divides politically for reasons that are unique to those countries. But Japan's critical turning point was the Second World War. So it was much longer ago. So in Japan's case, yeah, the anti-militarist culture continues to be a recruiting obstacle for the self-defense forces. But as you've said, especially after 3/11, the 3/11 triple disasters, and the incredibly positive role that the self-defense forces and the alliance, by the way, played in the recovery, that's one factor that I think has contributed to a more positive view of the self-defense forces. And I agree with you that first time I saw self-defense officers walking on the street or in the subway far away from their base, I was sort of surprised. But these days, there are whole TV shows that are focused around members of the self-defense forces. The self-defense force members and officers speak on television often. They testify in the Diet. So it's become more regularized, but regularized within a Japanese context. On the women front, yes, also big progress, relatively speaking. But I'll give you an anecdote from my initial field work in 2019. I was speaking to a personnel officer in the self-defense forces at the Ministry of Defense. And we were speaking in Japanese, and we were talking about goals for women. And when he told me the goal, I had to stop and sort of repeat because I was afraid that I misunderstood in Japanese. And he talked about this radical plan to increase the number of women in the self-defense forces to go from roughly 7% to 9% over 12 years. So a 2-point increase. So that's the current goal, is to get the number of women in the self-defense forces up to 9% by 2030. And I would not consider that in comparative terms a radical step forward. But I do agree with you that if we look at really just in the last 5 years, women making a number of milestones in the self-defense forces in the roles they're able to play, in the command roles they're in, that's an interesting correlation to the first decade of Japan's shrinking population and rapid aging. You see many, many milestones broken for women in the self-defense forces. So I would see that as a sort of glass half empty, half full. Yeah, I'd leave it at that.
Yeah, and that the increasing role of particularly in important roles like captain of a warship should also send a message to women that there is a possible career, that there are glass ceilings. Obviously, every Japanese woman knows that. Sometimes those ceilings are not glass, they're iron. But there are possible opportunities in the self-defense forces. The anti-militarist culture persistence is very interesting because it also persists in Germany, about which comparison of military activity abroad for Japanese and Germany, both of which have peace constitutions, so-called, but they wound up very different. The Germans have been able to be more active despite their peace anti-military subculture, and there are probably political reasons for that among the political elite more than anything else. But it is still very strong in Japan and somewhat strong in Germany as well. And I think we gave up the notion of political culture years ago in political science, but that should tell you something about maybe it's time to see how these attitudes are transmitted through several generations. My next question is very similar. I'm playing devil's advocate here, as you can tell. Japan still has, despite the anti-military subculture, despite the building up of the self-defense forces so strongly in recent years, particularly under Prime Minister Abe, still has a defense-only policy. That was not really changed much under even under Abe. There are self-defense force generals who seem to want to change that somewhat. And there are debates in Tokyo about things like first strike and things like that. But given that is all technological, not in terms of ground forces. Given the fact that Japan has this defense-only attitude, and it looks like it will persist, shouldn't that cut down on the need for a lot of personnel compared to countries like China, for example, which are prepared for offensive as well as defensive capabilities? But Japan does not have to prepare, at least yet, for offensive capability. Shouldn't that help in terms of the personnel problems?
Yeah, again, the short answer to the question is yes. Yes, it will help. One of the motivators for my current project, in fact, though, is my belief that it's really essential to consider defense questions relationally. That it doesn't work to just look at one country. You need to see who the country is trying to protect against, who the country's working with. And you mentioned technology as well. Of course, military technology continues to evolve, whether or not there's demographic change. But since there is demographic change, they're evolving in tandem and sometimes working together. And what I found, I think, is an important finding related to my comparative work is, just as you said, Ellis, certain military missions are much more manpower intensive than other military missions. And in general, yes, like a defensive posture is less manpower intensive than an offensive posture. So, for example, if we take something from the headlines these days, I think it's hard to not know that there is escalating tension around Taiwan and China's provocative and actions related to Taiwan. China trying to invade Taiwan and hold Taiwan would involve a huge amount of manpower, right? But trying to repel Chinese forces from invading an island also, of course, involves manpower, but much less manpower, right? The defensive situation is less manpower intensive. In the Japanese case, since we're focusing on Japan, many Japanese are concerned that China is looking for a pretext to occupy what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands in the southwest of Japan. They're uninhabited islands. Again, China aggressively deciding to land on those islands and maintain those islands is more manpower intensive than repelling people from doing that. So yes, there is an advantage in the defense that way. But that said, I also would like to kind of put the asterisk that if we use the Senkaku defense example as one of the most pressing security concerns that Japan has, Japan's maritime self-defense forces, their Navy and their Coast Guard are having severe personnel challenges to maintain all of the repelling and discouraging of Chinese military and non-military vessels around those islands. And it's also a kind of vicious circle, because it makes it harder for Japan to recruit for the self-defense forces in the Navy and the Coast Guard, because those forces are so heavily utilized, among other reasons. So even though, yes, I think comparatively Japan is in a better situation, there are still real manpower issues that Japan is facing, and some of them are increasing, not decreasing.
Yeah, great. And then also, things like manning warships does require personnel, and very trained personnel. Either they're recruited from among trained population in at least technology, or they have to be trained, which also requires more personnel. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Okay,
actually,
great.
if I could just sort of
Sure.
build on that point just briefly, Ellis, because I imagine others in the audience would have this question. When we talk about the plan to increase defense spending, or the LDP platform point of increasing defense spending, one of the main ideas that the LDP members who are advocating for this have for the extra money is to buy more planes and more ships. And these planes and ships then will need personnel to man them, right? So actually the spending issue is also a personnel issue at a time when the self-defense forces isn't able to even meet the current goals that they have. So that's where I think demographics really do play a role.
Okay. So that means we will switch it over to the audience questions. We have several questions, I believe at least 6 or 7. Let me first ask a very overarching question about the Asia Pacific. There's a couple of those related to the Quad. The first question about the Quad is Elizabeth wanted to know if demographic changes or projections have in fact been one of the reasons behind the US shift in policy toward the Quad and the building up of the Quad, which includes India, of course. I don't know, you don't have any access to the inner sanctums of the American government, even though you're in Washington. Who does? But would you speculate on whether there's been any influence of demographic thinking and the turn toward the Quad?
Well, it's a great question. Thank you, Elizabeth, for it. It has been a challenge in this year that I've been working on this topic from the Wilson Center, that I'm literally a block or two away from senior government policymakers, and there's almost no opportunities for in-person meetings even now. So I can't claim to have the insider knowledge of this, but in discussions that I have been able to do virtually, what I find is that the pressures that changing demographics are pushing towards are very similar or even overlapping with other trends in US defense policy. So the US already is trying to increase the number of security partners in the region. That was part of both the Obama administration policy, then the Trump administration policy, and now under Biden. So there's an overlap there. And also the military modernization using newer technologies has the sort of side benefit of in some cases saving labor, but I'm not saying that that's the main reason we're adopting the new technology, but it's a co-pressure point. So when you look at the Quad, India, as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, is the #1 most growing population country in the world. So they have a youth bulge, and so many opportunities there. Then Australia has an aging society. It's growing, however, because just like in the US, because of immigration. And so the Australian population is expected to grow substantially over the next 25 years. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I do believe that those are factors, but I wouldn't say that they're the determining factors, but I do think that they're important factors.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions further. One relates to the Quad and another one both to the Quad and technology. Anonymous wants to know if there's any evidence that the Quad and technology can overcome some of the problems that Japan faces, and a related, or perhaps opening up more to immigration, which I think is probably one of the reasons the US expects an increase in population because of our previous, at least up to 2016, immigration policies. And the other one from Robert is technology overcoming some of Japan's problems compared to its neighbors? So those are related, whether the Quad and technology can help Japan overcome its problems, particularly relatively compared to its neighbors that might threaten it.
Okay, so to Anonymous's, or first Anonymous's question about can the Quad and technology help Japan address the challenges that its difficult demographics are going to pose. Yeah, that's a resounding yes on both sides. So if we want to think about international relations theory for a moment, and what is military security for, right? I mean, my book is going to talk about different definitions of security, and obviously climate is a big issue in security. Of course, the pandemic is a serious security issue, so I will be addressing those things, but the core is going to be about military security. And so the doctrine that Japan and the US have been using, among others, is deterrence, right? So we want to make clear that we have resolve to protect things that are important to us, and you utilize deterrence by showing resolve and also showing capabilities, and by having a larger number of actors working together, you're increasing your capabilities in that way. So Japan is bolstering its defense by having credible partnership relationships with countries other than the United States. And again, that's a policy Japan's been following now for about a decade. It almost perfectly aligns, though, with Japan's shrinking population and rapid aging, is this shift from Japan thinking that the US is really the core security partner, the only security partner it needs, to Japan now having numerous security partnerships. And let me just give a shout out, not to any one particular person, but there's several people that have published terrific research in the last 5-6 years about Japan's budding security partnerships with virtually every country in the region, numerous edited books. I've been a part of some of them. So I think that's an area, the Quad, the partnerships. On the technology, and this kind of, as you noted, Ellis, transitions to the second question. Yes, Japan is at the leading edge of technology innovation in the world. And of course, the United States is the leading edge of military technology in the world. So our two countries working together gives a big advantage. There's numerous studies that come out of think tanks and US government institutions in Washington, public studies that rank and lists different types of military technologies, and will show where the US is in terms of its advantage over adversaries like China and North Korea. And frankly speaking, I doubt anyone in the audience will be surprised to hear this, the US-Japan advantage is eroding in essentially all areas, but in some areas it's eroding very seriously, and in other areas the US and Japan may remain far ahead. And here is another area where we can link back to partnerships. South Korea, for example, a country I'm going to next month, is a good example of a country that in some ways sort of thinks about regional security in a broadly similar way to how Japan thought about things decades ago. Not so interested in boots on the ground kind of direct military cooperation with other states, but South Korea signed, well, I shouldn't say signed, there was a joint declaration when President Biden met with South Korea's president to develop joint cyber resources and using Korea's advanced technology in that area. We're looking for South Korea to be important in 5G networks, in supply chain security. Here again, by utilizing partners, the US and Japan together can keep a technological advantage in military weaponry that can help with deterrence and help address some of the demographic challenges that, as I mentioned at the outset, many US allies and partners are going to be facing. So this is very important for the US as well as for Japan.
Yeah, I think it's even more important now. I know Brad Glosserman, both who wrote that book you talked about before and is a co-author of mine, is doing very interesting research on how technology and the changing economies and security are becoming more and more linked. So that becomes an even greater aspect of the answer that you gave. I have a couple of questions here on Japan and its relations with other regions. One from John down under is he wants to know if AUKUS, the US, Australia, Britain, UK, that is UK linkages now that there's been a lot of attention to, has had and it will have any effect on Japan's enthusiasm and engagement with Australia, bilaterally or multilaterally. And the other question is Africa, a country where I believe there are great population increases. And Yuriko wants to know if that in any way has been taken into account, or where it may increase ties of Japan to other countries, especially given China's penetration of Africa economically these days and other regions.
Sure. I like getting the two questions at once. I appreciate that. But I'll start in order. In the AUKUS issue, I think that there's understandably in the media a kind of predominant focus on with AUKUS about developing a nuclear powered submarine, right? And just for people who are more casual observers of security, to be very clear, it's a nuclear powered submarine, not a nuclear weapons submarine. That is a core aspect of the AUKUS deal, but the AUKUS deal is broader than that. It's about collaborating with very sensitive military technologies across the three partners who are already part of the so-called Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. So they are part of the countries that the US trusts most deeply for sharing intelligence. And Japan is not part of that Five Eyes group. Japan, as some in the audience may know, did make some big steps forward in satisfying US concerns about information security that the US had been concerned about with Japan for quite a while, but I think there are many steps to go before the US would feel comfortable sharing that kind of high-level intelligence. I think that what I've read at a kind of superficial level is a Japanese concern that, initially your viewers may recall that Japan was hoping to sell a submarine to Australia, and Japan was beat out by the French, right? And now the French are the ones who feel burned with Australia now going for the US-UK cooperation. But some have said, well, is that going to create bad blood between Japan and Australia for that? I think that happened already. So instead, I think what Japan wants to do is sort of emulate that deal. I don't think that it's very likely Japan can join that deal because of concerns that the partners have with intelligence sharing in Japan, but Japan can move in that direction. So I think it links to the earlier question about the Quad, that this is a good thing for Japan. Japan wants deepened security partnerships, and I think AUKUS can do that. I think it's sort of a leap then to think about the Africa case, but I'm glad it was brought up because one of the primary motivators of me writing this current book is that there's a wave of really good quality scholarly literature about the linkage between demographics and national security that was all written within a sort of 2008 to 2012 window. And I think what motivated that was the predictions of the first decade of shrinking populations and rapid aging that was being predicted. And so scholars wrote, I think, very logically sound, reasoned projections of what would happen in that decade. And to my knowledge, I'm one of the first people to then go back to that and say, okay, well, what did happen or didn't happen? And I think we're finding that many of the things that were projected didn't happen in the case of the Indo-Pacific. But another motivator of my book was to focus on one security region because the broad literature tries to discuss global security challenges. And in the global security challenge, sub-Saharan Africa's population boom is going to be one of the biggest global security challenges of the next several decades. The UN projections are that the population of sub-Saharan Africa will nearly double. It's like a 98% increase. So going from roughly, a little less than 1 billion to a little less than 2 billion. It's a huge increase. And then, on the northern part of Africa, in the Middle East, kind of area, you also see big population booms. So those are big security challenges. Europe is especially concerned about that. The US is concerned related to terrorism in that area. So I think the demographics are a very big driver of concern in that area. But it's very different than the situation that the Indo-Pacific is facing, where even the states that are growing in the Indo-Pacific are just not growing nearly as fast.
Okay, we have only 1 or 2 minutes left, so very short answers to the next domestic questions. We just shift the focus here at the end. One, are tax increases inevitable from Barry? The Japanese population doesn't like them very much. Most populations don't, but particularly the Japanese, even though they are not as highly taxed as many other developed countries. And the other one is, what about nationalism? Wouldn't that change the attitudes of youth if Japan, for example, was really, truly threatened? Won't that change very quickly? Can you have just a few word answers to those?
Yeah, okay, so speed round. On the second question, I love the question because I totally agree. You know, when a country gets attacked, if a country gets attacked, they generally mobilize for war. And even though the World Values Survey shows that only, 13% of Japanese say they'll fight for Japan if the country's attacked, I don't believe that. I think it's going to be a much higher number. But whether that, I'll make it a quick aside that, whether that's nationalism or not, I think is a question that maybe we could discuss offline. On the tax issue, it's not my area. I'm glad Ulrika is back online. She may want to comment on that. But I mean, I'll just say most broadly, there are only 3 possibilities for how to deal with the increased costs that Japan will experience related to its rapid aging and its growing defense needs. You either raise taxes, you cut spending in other areas, or you deficit spend. And from what I hear, I think that the deficit spending can't increase too much more than it already is. And some economists are saying, even the current levels of deficit spending aren't sustainable. So I think you will have to see cuts in other areas, but it would seem that taxes would be a part of that equation. But maybe they can be packaged though in terms of, hey, elderly population, you want better quality healthcare, or you want this extra benefit, maybe we should have a tax for that. It sounds a little bit like the discussions that are happening right around the corner from me in Washington right now.
Yes, yes, exactly. All right, great.
I wanted to footnote something before I ask another question, if I may. Andrew, I thought that was very interesting. When I saw the title of your talk, I thought also about the HR differences in the military systems. So in Japan, the GA-Tai, the self-defense forces, have lifetime employment, right? So unlike the United States, where young people join the military for a couple of years, get some training in some cases, and then quit and pursue a different career altogether. That's usually not the case in Japan at all. So what we also see is an aging of the actual self-defense forces, which is very top heavy right now with a lot of people in their 50s. And so there's another aging there that might have some national security implications that I thought we could also talk about. Now, I don't want to let you go before I ask you Patrick's question, which is always a great question to ask at the last round. And I want to ask it to both of you. So I'm going to start with Ellis, and then Andrew, you can be the last swinger at this at bat. What's worrying you most? Whether that's in Japan or for U.S.-Japan relations or for the entire regions, what are you worried most about in terms of national?
I'm going to answer that in terms of U.S.-Japan relations, I think. To a large extent. And that is, I'm most worried that in a crisis that I see is coming sometime in the future, Japan is going to get caught on its dual hedge. That has been Japanese policy for a long time. And that is hedging against China by its close military relations with the US and the alliance, and hedging against dominance of their economy by the US, which emerged from the trade friction of the 1980s and 90s, by close economic relations with China. The Japanese economy is very dependent on China now, for example. So Brad Gossaman and I, again, giving him a plug, have an article about this and the trouble that Japan may see in the future. I'm very worried that in a crisis, Japan is going to have to choose one or the other and suffer consequences one way or the other. My second great concern is that Trump will return to power in 2024, and then all bets are off on all policy. And I say that not in a partisan way, although probably subliminally it is, but because I think he had roiled up relations with allies quite substantially when he was in power, and I think it'll be worse next time. I'll stop there.
Okay, I will.
Okay, Andrew.
I will refrain from commenting on the second point as a fellow at the Wilson Center, an avowedly nonpartisan institution. But on the first question about my biggest concern, you know, I'm living 24/7 about demographics in 16 countries in the region and trying to understand the security concerns among the dyads. And I think that my biggest concern is that more and more of the sort of 6 aging, shrinking countries they're becoming very aware of this problem. And I worry that they're going to work to try to lock in advantages now before things get worse later. And I think we see this in the case of China very clearly. You know, they're going to go off a kind of what Nick Aberstadt at the American Enterprise Institute here calls the demographic cliff because of their one-child policy that was implemented in the late 1970s. The Chinese demographics change very dramatically. And so their workforce is going to massively shrink starting in the late 2020s. And that gives a real incentive for China to build up its military capabilities now, to try to achieve some of its main security policy objectives now before there's more social unrest. And so I say now, I mean in the next 5 or 6 years. And certainly seeing the concerns about Taiwan in the papers every day is an example of that concern. But also on the Japanese side, I want to end on the core issue of the Japan Zoomina on Japan. I think that a concern that Japan, I think, understandably has is that as a known aging power, in a deterrence posture, Japan has to be careful not to appear weak or appear declining, right? So there's a strategy incentive to be bolsterous, right? To talk about doubling defense spending, even if that may not be very politically feasible. And so there's a small window for miscalculation there that I'm concerned about, like, for example, related to the Senkaku Islands. So I think, I would like to end my contribution to Zoomina to say, Japan has contributed to the peace and stability of the East Asian region, as of other powers, in enjoying tremendous peace and prosperity for decades and decades, right? And I think that needs to be the kind of overriding goal of all states in the Indo-Pacific, is to keep that peaceful structure in place. So I think a number of the things we talked about today, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad, I mean, this is the goal, right, is to keep the peace. And I think we need to focus on that aspect of the peace. We talk about military and keep escalation from happening. But my concern then is that miscalculation in the next 5 or 6 years.
And that fits in very nicely with a recent article in Foreign Policy, which the argument was the real danger of China in the next few years is not that they are so strong and a rising power, but in fact that they have reached their peak and are going to start declining, and that's when it gets dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. I can't be long before there's a peak China book out there. Sorry.
I wish we could end on a happier note, but we can't. And so thank you for this. Lots to think about, lots to unpack and digest. Thank you, audience, for staying with us until the bitter end. Thank you, Professor Andrew Oros, for joining us today. And audience, come on back in 2 weeks. We'll talk about the elections, not only in Japan, but also Germany and, of course, the US. It's November 2nd. So it's an off year, but it's still important. So join us in 2 weeks for another interesting round of conversation, I hope. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.